And as Wes was saying, we are really pleased to have Steve Marshall with us today. I personally got to know Steve through an effort through the UTC that is sponsoring this effort. Put in something for a research project, and so did Steve, and ours were integrated, if you will. We call it an arranged marriage, but an amicable one.
Shotgun integration.
Indeed. Steve comes, he is a multidisciplinarian, if ever there was one, including time spent on the executive board for the Safe States Alliance. And Steve also works in the Department of Epidemiology here within the Gilling School of Public Health, which is numero dos in the country after Johns Hopkins. But we're inching on him, right? Yeah. Steve is a quantitative epidemiologist. He's been doing this for over 25 years in a variety of contexts related to injury prevention and injury interventions, road safety being one of them. And he's been working at the Injury Prevention Research Center for since 1994, it sounds like, and the director since 2011. He claims, and I believe it's true, that he's very excited to be working with us in the kind of traffic safety realm, and as well, particularly the group at the Highway Safety Research Center, and this here, the City and Regional Planning. So without further ado, I'm going to invite a warm welcome to Steve Marshall.
After that great introduction, I think I'll just quit. I don't have anything that can top that. Thanks, Seth. Thanks. Really appreciate all of our HSRC and City and Regional Planning colleagues joining with us in the UTC, and appreciate everyone's willingness to be receptive to new ideas as we go forward. So, I guess just get the real business out of the way. My son shot this photo on Lake Salem, so you'll see numerous amounts of tornado posting. So I would describe myself as aspiring to become a novice in systems science at one point, right? So definitely I am not a systems scientist. I am a consumer of their stuff, right? But I never published a paper with a systems dynamics model. So to say that when I say this is a learning space, that's like code for go gentle on the aging professor this morning. Because some of you out there in the audience have more exposure to stuff than I do. And I would encourage that we just have a conversation, dialogue as I go through, because this stuff is a journey, not a destination. So speak up and interact as we go along. There's 3 papers. This is probably a little ambitious. Well, everything is a little ambitious. So we're probably not going to get to talk much about the McMillan paper. My starting supposition would be that as a species, we're not very smart in a communal sense. As a species, we're individually smart, but as a collective, we're actually not done shit. So, and it's because of the nature of us as an animal. Right? We're very, very social animals, but we're also highly competitive animals, which is kind of an unusual, quirky sort of niche, probably some sort of aberration in the grand scheme of nature. But we're the inverse of bees. Right? Bees, the collective intelligence is more than the sum of the parts. If I take an individual bee and look at it, it's really just a cog. And it's even a cog that will take on different needs. But people are not like that. You take a person, you look at it, it looks like a relatively intelligent animal. It's just, when you put them together, they are less than the sum of the parts, unlike the bees, which their intelligence is in the collective. So we're good at fighting battles against one another, but we're not very good at winning wars together. And our political process and many of our social processes in the past 5 years underscore our ability to actually work against one another. and end up in a more divisive state or an increasingly divisive state, which sometimes is exploited, by other nations. So what's particularly notable, I think, about our political processes is that they're very poor at planning for change. So, the classic point would be, Social Security. It's going to be bankrupt if we don't do something to fix it. We've known this for goodness knows how long. I've been paying into the system since the 1990s, and it was known then that if we didn't make certain changes, it would go bankrupt, right? And so, my pay goes up. My pay in December is more than my take-home pay in January. Because at some point during the calendar year, I max out my Social Security contributions. That makes no sense, people. I would be happy to continue paying at the same level. But I don't have the option to do that. Like, I can't even donate to the fund. This is the antithesis of long-term planning. You've got a system that's going to fail. You've got people who would do things to keep the system going, and they're not allowed. So we're not necessarily good at planning for change. Nothing underscores this more than the tragedy of climate change. Right now, we screwed up. We, as scientists, totally blew this. We lost it. We could have done the right thing. Instead, we created a debate about whose fault it was. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter why the world is warming up. It just is warming up. It's probably not because of the things we thought it was because of. It's probably just that it is naturally warming for whatever reason. It doesn't matter. It's time to stop building condos in Florida. Right? It's time to stop developing New Orleans. Just get out of it. It's over. We've lost. It's going to go underwater. It has been going underwater. It's going to go underwater some more. Our inability to communicate this is our single greatest failure as scientists. We fretted about studying climate change. We didn't fret about how to communicate in order to get a policy change. That's the single greatest failure as scientists. It's not, we do good work, but then we just kind of like, this is a pretty fact or an interesting piece of results. We'll just put it out there and not worry what happens to it, right? That's abdication of responsibility. It's not just dumb, it's unethical. We have a responsibility to figure out how to communicate the complexities of the situation to people. Like I said, people are smart animals, individuals. So most people are capable, in an intuitive way, of understanding complexity. It's not that people are stupid, people are very good. The trouble is that we haven't been good at communicating, developing methods for communicating complexity. So, we think we're a smart animal, right? But we're actually not. We're less organized than insects. We're way less happy than our colleagues who dwell in the ocean, our colleagues of the large mammals. We seem to be hell-bent on destroying the planet. We're great at inflicting untold pain and suffering on one another. You just look at our communities, let alone start to add up all the wars and genocides. And we seem to be, for various reasons, be they political or theological, utterly unable to control our rampant population. By any measure, we are the biosphere's cancer. So, to illustrate the problem, this is a tree called Agatha astralis, arguably the greatest tree. It is an astounding tree to encounter. Early settlers in New Zealand thought they had walked into walls or cliffs, and actually they had encountered a tree. There's such impressive trees. I can make the case for the California redwood. It's also an inspiring tree. In some ways, it's a more visually impressive tree, but if you look at the statistics, which I'm continuing to do, the Kauri is right. It's goes up to 50 meters, 15 meter girth. So 15 meter, that's 45 feet around. So it takes a village to hug this tree. Matures, around the 500-year mark, lives for about 2,000 years. My home country, New Zealand, was once covered with millions of acres of this beautiful, astounding tree. And that is an ecosystem that would have been worth untold billions of dollars in today's global ecotourism market. So what do we do with it? Logged the jeepers out of it and turned it into ships. Right? This is the world in the 19th century had a great need for tall, straight pieces of wood that could be used as ship masts. Because sailing was the world's commerce, and here was a tree with an amazingly straight trunk, with no laterals at all because it drops those during the first 200 years of its life cycle, and this looked like a boon for sailing. And the pace of deforestation still, I think, impresses me so much that without chainsaws, or even steam engines, we were capable of removing, in very hilly terrain, approximately 3/4 of this forest in under 50 years. And these are men who worked hell for leather to cut these things down, right? With hand saws. Great achievement if the goal is deforestation. So eventually we figured out that probably wasn't the best way to conserve a resource that takes 2,000 years to come to maturity. So while there were still a few remnants left, they were put aside as parklands, which now do attract a steady tourist market, and internal and external, domestic and international. So first lesson, markets as a system maximize short-term profits. No surprise there. So what's happening with the rest of the trees? Probably on their way out. There's a pathogen that infects their roots, and of course this is something that came from another country, sometime, probably in the 1970s. Was basically unknown until about five years ago. People in shoes are the main vector for spreading this pathogen, but it's vulnerable to disinfectant. So you can disinfect your shoes. So New Zealand, in its wisdom, has set up all of these voluntary disinfection stations throughout all of its remaining forest areas. And guess what? Doesn't work. Because people can't see that their shoes are getting clean. It depends on voluntary activity in wilderness areas. Right? And there's various estimates, but compliance anecdotally is somewhere between 0 and 20%, depending on the trail and the time. We're now closing the few remaining parks. Closing means no humans, and there will be patrolled areas. But a lot of spread has already happened, and there was an opportunity to take dramatic action. But we took a soft action, and so failure to think of the people in the forest as an interdependent system is probably doomed if you're in the forest. So how do we get people to step back from their own self-interest and see the big picture, right? This is the big picture. This is the outbacks. I think this woman had a really cool sense of how to explain to people the importance of complex systems like voter patterns, like climate change, like conserving threatened forest areas. So in this paper, what she did, and it's an old paper from 2002 from Nevada, And she used outputs from a systems dynamic model to explain to people how to conserve water in Las Vegas. So Las Vegas is notable for having a lot of population growth and being in the middle of a desert. So for its water resources, it depends almost solely on a nearby lake system called Lake Mead. I think, when they say lake in Arizona and Nevada, it usually means not what we would think of as a lake, but it's sort of a place where water occasionally congregates. In this, what she did in this work is she built a system plan model and then held a series of workshops. Actually, it's kind of like a prototype. So it's really a very small, fewer than 100 people were involved in like 8 or so workshops. So it's very much a prototype sort of system. But in this project, what she's doing is taking, having constructed a model, she's taking outputs from the model out into the community. And the community are just regular people who don't have a grounding in water conservation or systems theory. And she's showing them outputs, how the model works, and explaining the complexity of the water conservation system in Las Vegas. And then she's offering them the chance to generate some inputs to the model, and then running the model for them, so that people can suggest different policy actions and see the results of those actions. And the complexity of water conservation in Las Vegas is actually an interesting, it's like a lot of, it's well suited to a systems dynamics sort of model, because the results are counterintuitive and don't sit well with what people expect. So when you go to Las Vegas, you see a lot of water consumption by casinos and hotels. And whenever she started her workshops, the residents would point to the copious water consumption by the casinos and hotels. I don't know if this is still true, but when she did this work 15 years ago, that actually accounted for very little of Las Vegas's water consumption. What accounted for most of their water consumption was, you got it. Technically, it's outdoor residential use. But yes, people put water on plants, which are doomed to frickin' die. It's the desert. They put water on their lawns and on their outdoor plants. And in this era, 40% of their water consumption came from that source. And the other big picture of it was 25%, which came from indoor residential use, which was flushing your commode and showering, scrubbing the vegetables, and all those good things. So within the watershed system, and casinos, hotels, etc., are less than 10%. Like I say, I don't know if that's still true. No. So within the water system, the indoor residential use is mostly returned into the watershed. I'm going to use that term in a, it's not like the Great Dismal Swamp, right? But the residential indoor use kind of basically allows the city to return something to the river through a treatment facility, and that earns them credits, which allows them to take more out of the river, what they put back plus an extra lot. The outside residential use, of course, naturally just runs away into the desert or evaporates, to be frank. And so it's lost to the system. So the system is counterintuitive in that one of the biggest consumers is not the most obvious consumer. Two, it's there's a part of the system that has a positive feedback loop, which is internal residential use, and part of the system that has a external or a negative, no feedback loop. So here is what she presented to people. What she presented to people was, and of course there's population, which is the single biggest driver, but a very hard thing to manage. And there's the opportunity to mine other sources of water as well. So what she showed was, here's demand projected through 2050. Here's how much water we actually have, right? Which is a fixed amount. And then here's how much we can get by, cribbing from other places, right? And the whole problem she posed to her community groups was, what are the policy decisions we need to make in order for our demand not to exceed our supply? So the challenge she posed to her groups was, try to push, this line here is the point at which demand exceeds supply. Try to think of strategies that will push this to the right, so that we have as long as possible there. And so to do this, what she did is presented them with kind of, the scale is so important for people, and geography is so important for people. Because when you show them a system in geographic terms, we all get that. I mean, we all used to get it back in the days when you called AAA, you got a trip that, who knows what I'm talking about. It came on carrier pigeon. Nowadays, who knew 10 years ago that Google Maps would be something that we just instinctively went to for not just mapping, but any planning decision. So geography is a way to introduce systems to people. So she introduces the system in geographic terms. And then these are the two primary elements, right? And then this is like the little intro to the workshop. Then each step is an additional level of abstraction beyond that, right? So her next step is to show them a diagram of the water system, still with some geographic anchors, right? So here's where we draw from. Here's going into the city, right? Notice how it kind of looks like this. Going into the city, distribution system, the consumption system, right? And then here's the recycling system, which is scrubbing it. There's some surface flow, and returning it through, quote, wetlands, back into the bay, right? So she's showing people the concept of a system, but in a mix of abstract and geographic terms. And this is all done just, in a short passage at the start of the workshop. And then the next level of complexity is to draw that in terms of a systems dynamics model, right? So these are things called stocks and flows. And so here, basically, she's done the systems dynamics model in a way that still retains some of the geographic elements. So here's the population part of the model, which is people moving into the area and people moving out of the area. And those are things that, we can model population growth in Las Vegas. We'll just provide a series. She uses the model from the city to model. And then those people, that leads to water demand. There's other sources of water demand, residential and non-residential. Water demand leads to water being withdrawn from the system. Here's the amount they're allowed to take out of the Colorado River. Here's other sources of supply, which is kind of a future thing where they might be able to get water from somewhere else. And here's the water distribution system. Here's the outdoor use, and here's the indoor use. So the indoor use is treated and then returned to the watershed, and then recycled in the system, right? So the indoor use is not a net loss. Plus, the city gets a credit, which allows them to draw down more water. So that creates like a positive feedback loop here. The outdoor use, the water exits from the system. So we can increase the available water supply by maximizing our indoor use. That's the indoor residential use, and minimizing our outdoor residential use. So, all right, that's a complex system, and none of us live in Las Vegas, we all use water. But it's a pretty elegant way to step through what is a complex system in a very intuitive kind. Really, really quickly. And then, so you ask people, what are our policy options, right? What do we want to, and people suggest things like stop the casinos from using too much water. Well, casinos only account for 10% of what gets drawn, so that has very little impact. And people suggest other things, like maybe we get more water from other places. Well, that's really hard to do, really expensive and limited. Well, people would suggest things like, maybe we can, only flush the toilets on Thursdays. But we can find other strategies for reducing our indoor water use. Well, that actually penalises you because then you're able to draw less down from the system. So, the big lever here is reducing residential outdoor water use. Right? And so, Las Vegas actually did this, right? Like they actually paid people to destroy golf courses. So you could actually, for a while, make a lot of money by installing a golf course in the area, selling a bunch of memberships, and then refunding some of those memberships, and getting a bonus from the city to remove the golf course. Right? That was actually a little cottage industry. It was opening golf courses and then removing them. I'm not saying it makes sense. I'm just saying that maybe we don't need so many golf courses in Texas. So with this kind of tool, right? So this is what she does in her workshops. Little introduction to the problem, overview of the water system structure, rooted in geography, so that people can have physical anchors. Facilitate a discussion about what can be done, and then stepping through progressively abstractive maps so transition from a geographic map to a systems map, right? And explain the purpose of the model is to evaluate the difference of relative merits of different policy options, and then use the model in front of people to simulate the effects of different management strategies. In this way, people develop an intuition that includes the complexity of the system. Wouldn't it be great if we did elections like this? So, how to explain the key elements that govern the system's response to policy interventions is a key part of what you do when you're in resource management. But in resource management, there's this big mandate to engage the interests of stakeholders who have very variable levels of technical expertise. With this approach, she's got a model that greatly enhances, I'm not just feeding information to people, they're actually engaged and develop an intuition for the system. And then an additional benefit of this is that she found it shifted discussion from who was to blame for running out of water to how to solve it. Right? That's a really positive shift in human interaction. And anyway, there's a little more detail on what she did. I don't want to take up too much time talking it. So you can see the strategy, by the way, from a career standpoint, is when you have no research in the field, and you're invited to give a talk, you talk about it, I think it's research. Just career guidance strategy. Nice study. I'm really thankful to Anne-Marie White from Rochester, who sent me the paper. Also really thankful to Becky, who sent me this paper, I believe. Kind of more of an application to our field, to transportation and safety. Right? So in this article, which we're heading back to New Zealand, done by my colleagues in the University of Auckland, where I was an undergrad there for a while. I didn't have the world's most distinguished undergraduate career. I don't know how else. A lot of time spent on different types of research that we won't talk about. In this study, they were interested in. So Auckland is like the world's most ridiculous setup for a city. It's basically hills and ocean, and it's separated by a harbour. It's like physically impossible to make this work as a transportation system. And there's one bridge across the harbour, which is no bike lanes or no pedestrian walkway. And everyone goes back and forth across this bridge, which is only 8 lanes. It's an absolute disastrous system. And so now that they've gone to a system of saying, well, we'll make the bridge move and everything else will be in gridlock. Because that's more palatable to people than the other system in which everything doesn't move and the bridge is also in gridlock. So it's a disaster. So there's various reasons for wanting to maximize commuter cycling. Trouble is, you're going to go old streets, narrow streets, not a lot of great infrastructure for cyclists. So in this study, they used a systems dynamics model to look at a couple of different options. And the options they looked at are basically do absolutely nothing, just continue as we come over. Have more mixed-use roads. The third option is what they call arterial segregated bike lanes. They basically install arterial road that is cyclist only. So, and they've tried this. So when you drive down the freeway over there, you see these big tubes that come out of nowhere and kind of loop around and go off to somewhere else, right? And those are these cycle arterial roads, right? And they're slinging these big tubes underneath the bridge. And then the fourth option is basically, what these authors call self-explaining ways, which is a fancy way of saying basic traffic calming sort of measures that we're all pretty familiar with as ways to integrate slow urban speed and integrate cyclists into the pathways a little bit. So the question they will face is, what's the best bang for the buck? Like, where do I put my money? What's the return on investment long term in these various options? And the things that they wanted to consider are a proportion of people who bicycle, injuries and deaths to bicyclists, the death rate per 1,000 cyclists, right? So I might be willing to accept more injuries if I lower the rate. So if I boost the number of cyclists, but I keep the rate low or even drive it down, then I might see a rise in the number of deaths and injuries, but maybe that's worth it. And then mortality from air pollution is another. So I like the paper because they looked at a couple of different outcomes that are interrelated and looked at the effect of different options. So this is their model, their systems dynamic model, right? At the middle of the model is the cyclists, obviously. Cyclists generate injuries at variable rates, and injury is a deterrent to cycling. So there's a positive arrow there, a negative arrow there, right? And this represents a feedback loop. Real and perceived risk of injury is a key element of increasing cycling and reducing the number of injuries. Okay? So this is what they're interested in, is what are the investments? Those things I just went through, doing nothing, traffic calming, arterial roadways for cyclists, those are our different investment options in terms of infrastructure. And then there's perception or social norms around cycling. Undoubtedly, the single most brilliant innovation of this paper, I think, is these dotted lines, right? So the dotted lines are things that we think of as important, but that we didn't bother to single. Yes. I didn't know you were allowed to do this. draw in the lines, but not actually model them. Really, really, really great discovery. And so in there, so obviously they built this model, they have a lot of inputs into the model, there's a 20-page appendix, which goes through the technical details. And the bottom line is that if you spend big, you get more returns. Right? So the best investments in terms of more cycling, minimizing the increase in the absolute number of injuries, holding the rate of injuries low, and reducing air pollution consequences, the best investment is in arterial roads and traffic. And that outperforms everything else in the market. Now, this is also the most expensive investment, right? Like building arterial roads just for cycling. People know what I mean by arterial roads? It's basically a corridor, like 15501 around Chapel Hill is a corridor. I'm sorry, I apologize, that was the definition. So, if the biggest investment produces the biggest return, obviously, on all of these things. the returns associated with mixed-use roads are predictably horrible, right? Not much better. So mixed-use roads are basically kind of, what we've got out here on camera, right? That is a scenario where we spend a bunch of money, not a whole lot of money, mostly paint, right? But we spend a little bit of money retooling those, but it doesn't really outperform, baseline in some of these models. This one, right? And it's because, it doesn't really protect cyclists, right? You're in the mingle with the other traffic. And also it doesn't really boost cycling because people perceive that as hazardous. Because of this. So, seemed like, a valuable paper because I think of all the different outputs they were able to simulate and model, and, obviously has value for policymakers who say, well, if I spend big on these two options, what do I actually get out of it? And this is the thing I hear from people like David Price. So this would qualify, I think David used this term with me, that these things would qualify as what David calls social engineering. It's an old term. It's basically where we try and construct a built environment that funnels people into certain types of behavior. And so David says, the reason why these things don't get more support from people like me, and I'm a supporter, is that no one can show me the numbers. How much money will it cost? We know that. It costs a boatload, and it always costs more than it's projected to cost. But how much will it save? What's the actual return on investment? Right? And so this is a way to actually get at. And that's, I think, the beauty of these types of models is their ability to look at different possibilities. So from the epidemiology side, we spent 20 years agonizing about causal inference. And these models, it's just kind of like, forget about causal inference, let's just have a model, right? Or, in the other article, the one from Las Vegas, she says, it pretty much tracks to the data and no one objected to the things in the model, so I thought that it had validity. Hey, you can publish that, yeah, what is it? That's impressive. So, in the School of Public Health, particularly in our department, we spend a lot of time. We have entire research groups and whole meetings devoted to the topic of what is the appropriate basis for causal inference. And we do diagrams, but not systems diagrams, but causal inference diagrams. We're sort of, this literature by and large, I could be wrong, correct me if I'm wrong, has kind of focused more on policy options and has kind of glossed over the causal inference opportunity. Right? So once again, defining causality is a complex topic. Right? Like did I cause that to fall, or did gravity cause it to fall? Actually establishing that A causes B turns out to be freaking impossible with science. Science is useless at this. But people have an intuitive idea of causality. So, and these models certainly allow us to simulate different types of causal processes. But from our point of view as epidemiologists, got to be another step, another level of evolution to integrate some of our causal structures into these types of models. Okay, last paper I want to talk about was, these are from CDC authors. And this kind of gets back to the impetus for thinking about these environmental terms in terms of our political processes. So Rod came from Australia to take a number 2 job in the National Injury Centre and stayed for about the amount of time I thought he could stomach it, and had a big impact on our part of CDC in terms of making them think about systems from an injury prevention perspective. So this is the paper in which Rod and a couple of other, Natalie will be here in a couple of weeks, Karen Mag, a lot of us interact with her, she's wonderful, in which they kind of laid out, the manifesto. So Rod's terminology, because you've got to invent new terminology all the time, invest in old terminology. Rod's terminology is let's move away from systematic approaches and towards systemic approaches. It's very important to get these right. So what do we mean by systematic approaches and what do we mean by systemic approaches? So Rod's concept of systemic approaches kind of looks a little bit like the sort of stuff I used to do when I was a rebel rouser. It looks like community organizing. My dad was a union organizer. You build local capacity. We do that all the time. We spend a lot of time doing community training and injury prevention. You try to create linkages between grassroots movements and wider movements. You try to build social movements, recruit local organizations, and then lift them up so that they understand how much impact they can have. And then that all feeds into community change, which then drives more of this, right? So not a formal diagram, just a sketch based on anecdotal. So how do these things happen, right? How can systems models help us? Systems models can help us by, this business of building local capacity, right? Means helping people understand complexity and how they can have an impact. So here's Rod and Karen and Natalie's take on it. Seatbelts work, speed limits work, crash barriers work, We know these things work. I went to TRB last month, Transportation Research Board. Everyone said, we have all these things that work. How many times I've heard David Harkey say this? We have all these things that work that aren't correctly adopted. And that's the fault of society. Wrong. It's our fault. We haven't equipped our community advocates with the information they need to implement the social change. Right? There's a missing link here. It's the communication of complexity and the upskilling of the community. People understand complexity and are intelligent individually. So you need to arm your advocates. So Rod's take on it, these components can only influence our population level if they're incorporated into a bigger structure, a systemic change. Where it says driven by strong public demand for change, leadership from society, a need for climate safety, infrastructure, and a long-term perspective. And I think the hard part is the long-term perspective, because a lot of community action is driven by short-term outrage. Witness all the furore about whether or not we should, have legislation about firearms. I mean, this is just, we're fighting a war against people with guns. That's really dumb. You always lose war against people with guns. It doesn't matter whether we ban semi-automatic weaponry or not. People want those things. America likes to have guns. It's their identity. I mean, this wasn't true 20 years ago, but now it is. People's identity is wrapped up in having a machine that can kill hundreds of people in 10 minutes. We're at that place. We're there. It's us. What we need to do is show the people the complexity of the system so that they can solve their own problem. Our allies are the NRA, ultimately. A colleague out in Colorado, he does suicide prevention. He works with people who've come back from sandy places, Iraq and Afghanistan. And they are hurt in multiple ways, many of them mentally, and some of them experience feelings of suicide. And they hunt. Their identity isn't hunting. So what do you do with men who are feeling that they might need to take their own lives to end the pain? And know how to use weapons. They know how to kill people very efficiently. And they're very well armed. Can you take away their hunting weapons? How do you solve that system? So here's what another vet in the group suggested. When hunting season is over, clean your weapons, strip them down, lock them away. Take the key to the lockbox, put it in a jar, and put it in the freezer. That's suicide intervention in action. But that's our community, that's our partners. We have to work within the institutions and infrastructure that we have. So I had some exercises here about, now I've talked for a long time, so let me throw the floor. Oh, wait. So I think if we do this, we can get to a better place as a society, right? And I think we can do that, right? It's not about injury prevention, it's not about highway safety at the end of the day. For me, learning how to communicate with systems concepts, it's about making those things disappear, right? Like, I want injury prevention to be out of business because I just want it to be natural and reflexive, and everyone does that. I want to embed the rationale for highway safety into the fabric of our society. So it's about creating an opportunity for civil discourse. Holy shit, that's something we've kind of forgotten how to do this. It's about making a better world for our grandchildren. And I think it's possible. And I think it's possible because we already start to imagine it in our science fiction books, which as we all know science fiction is all about today. Anyone who does science fiction understands that science fiction is an opportunity to comment on the world. So if these erudite Balkans can live in a world of logic and civil discourse, that means that we can, because we imagine it. This world was brought to us for a reason. And also Leonard Nimoy was just such a good. All right, now I'm done. Open questions. Sorry about that.
All right, as always, think about your questions just real quick. Make sure that if you are on your way out, that you leave your reflection sheet. And if you haven't signed in, please sign in. Thank you so much for being here. I know Steve will be here around for a little bit longer to answer questions, and several of us will as well. So thank you so much, Steve.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Yes.
So a bunch of the students who are in the Department of City and Regional Planning need to take a theory class. And in that class, we learn about the rational decision-making model. People who are in it now refresh my memory because it was a year ago. But one of the kinds of premises or conclusions that I drew after that lesson was getting additional information, especially in the planning process, is not always going to lead us to a better outcome. If we can try as planners to gather as much information as we possibly can, and it's still maybe not even as good of a decision as we can make using other types of decision-making approaches. So what would be the system's dynamics response to that kind of theoretical conundrum?
So the conundrum is that the information you have is so sparse that the additional information doesn't really help? Or is it that you already have a sufficient information?
You already have some information, maybe it's not perfect, or you don't have all of it. Or
but you have enough to need to act.
Or there are human dynamics at play that prevent you from acting on that information, or I don't know. That's what I'm feeling.
Right. So in this paper, right, what she did is she built a model and she took it out into the community. And so, but there's another approach which is called group modeling, where you build the models with the community on board. So, in that process, you can actually identify not having the correct information. Sometimes that will emerge as a real need, because people now have amazing expectations, and I blame CSI. But people really think that, and phones, just all seem like an error. People expect that databases are more coherent, that they talk to one another, and are better organized than they actually are. So sometimes, from the stakeholders, it becomes clear that there's a need for better information systems. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think like planning information needs so that they can inform your plan. No, you have a need for an immediate decision, but there's also a long-term need so that the people 5 years from now are in the same context.
Kind of along on the same line as your question. So in the Nevada example that you talked about, do you think that that particular systems workshop with the community only worked because it was about water? Because water, everyone, they need water. Like, would that have worked in the New Zealand case with trees, where obviously, everyone in this room probably wants to preserve those trees, but maybe you have to have that community backing in a very, very important issue that could mean life or death for it to be successful.
I think this approach works with anything. I think there are some things where getting people up to speed with a concept is too much of a hurdle. So I'm still not sure that I understand Bitcoin, for example. Despite having worked at it pretty much for 5 or 10 minutes here. Or cryptocurrency in general, and crypto markets and how they work. So I think there's some things that are really ridiculous. But yeah, things like the trees, definitely. I think, your market force is the short-term reward, but they don't understand the long-term cost of it. I think people who run corporations make crappy decisions a lot of the time, not because they're evil men and women, but because they don't have enough information. And the information they don't have is about long-term consequences, right? So like allowing sexual harassment to foster within the organization. They don't have the projection that shows them how that can destroy their workforce retention and their profit line. Or excessive deforestation, like is occurring in the Amazon right now. People don't have the long-term projection to show them that your return on investment is starting to disappear, because ultimately this is going to be more who's standing there. When tobacco companies and before that people who made asbestos, when they first learned about the damage that tobacco and asbestos could do, they decided to pretty much keep it quiet. When our drug companies first noticed that they were selling a lot of product, but there sure were many, many people in the morgue from overdoses, they kept it quiet. And they kept it quiet not because they're bad people, but because they didn't have quantitative information that showed them the long-term cost of those cover-ups. The long-term cost of those cover-ups was huge. Right? Like tobacco lost a huge amount of their market in the United States. And they had to pay billions of dollars to states in tobacco sales. Drug companies, are currently being sued by state attorney generals. So if those corporate people had had better projections, like you can do with it, I think they would have made better decisions. And if they hadn't made better decisions, then it would have been stronger raw material for lawsuits. There's no downside.
2 questions. One,
But to answer your question, I think this works with anything. But it works better with things that where the behavior of the system is counterintuitive, and where there's it doesn't work good for like a one-time decision, but for an ongoing decision, like a policy decision, it works great. I think it doesn't work well if you're deciding where to put a refuse station. But I think because you build it, they put the refuse station somewhere else, and you spend all this time and money on a decision. Yeah.
So I had 2 questions. One, so I've just taken this one health policy systems analysis class, and we spent a lot of time on what would be the equivalent of these appendices, which is building the coefficients, finding the coefficients in the literature in order to pull into your model. And when you don't have it, you have to guess, and guess in this case, ideally with the community input on what reasonable ranges or letting other people set ranges. So that was my understanding of where causal inference can help, which is to give those one-on-one relationships.
Yeah.
On the flip side, saying, well, we got this from science isn't the same as asking community members to fill in your model with, if I were to change this, how much do you think this would change? And building off of that. So I wonder, one, about the balance of those 2 things. And the second question, back to the industry comment you were saying, I'm thinking about how much is acceptable risk or acceptable collateral damage, even on the scale of billions, with something like the tobacco industry or pharmaceutical industry, or with our Dawn colleague Steve Ling's work with CAFOs. Like when it's not, when it is the casino in this example, so like it's not, it is a political body that has lobbying power, and maybe that's known. How does system modeling help? When it's tobacco industry, it's not.
Okay.
So we know it's industry. When it's known that it's industry, does this still have a role, and how does it work?
How many of these 15 questions should we answer?
Whichever coefficients or industry.
Okay, so I think that any industry is in better shape if they're not sued for tobacco. So I think there's, in the United States, the threat of litigation is very powerful consideration around corporate boardrooms. I also think that, you can't sell a product if it's killing people in record numbers. I think we've seen in the automobile industry, and there's a difference of opinion about this, but I would say there have been very poor stewards of the industry from a safety standpoint. Seatbelts had to be created by people outside the industry, and then people had to insist that children have car seats. And none of this was done by the industry. The industry actually tried to undermine and fire. This was all done by community people. Right? So a lot of the major gains in safety in automobiles that the automobile industry wants to claim credit to were actually, they don't not entirely claim any credit at all, marketing, because they're all driven by community people and research. And in the 1970s, when we were going around every state legislature trying to get car seat laws passed, the legislatures had a term, they called it chaining up the little league. That was their term for car seats. Right? Now you can't leave a hospital with a baby without a car seat. Right? But in the 1970s, car seats were unknown. They're not unknown, but they were not popular, and they were not mandated. And state legislatures called it chaining up the little league. Can you imagine? What a bunch of doors. Anyway, so that's the climate that people fought these wars 50 times over. In North Carolina, right, Highway Safety Research Center went to Raleigh, campaigned for child car seats. Right? The people in Raleigh, in their infinite wisdom as elected officials, code morons, wrote in an exemption at the last minute to allow a grandmother or a parent to carry a child in her arms in the passenger seat, because nothing could be safer than being in mama's arms. Right? HSRC went back the next year and got every mother who had had the experience of crushing her baby in a car crash to speak to them. They got the exemption taken. That's what I call engaged science, a good piece of scholarship. Kudos, HSRC. Within our discipline, we have like a group of people who are interested in these models and not too worried about the parameter size. Just like throwing some number and get it done, right? That's Sandor and Kerry's approach. We also have a group of people who spend a lot of time refining their causal inference methodology. It's like at the mayor. There's no point in playing with them now. I really think you need to work to a middle ground where we have a systems dynamic model that also fulfills our basic criteria or some criteria for causal inference. It's a big stumbling block, especially when now that School of Public Health has an innovation lab for systems models and an innovation model for causal inference. You can solve that for me. Navigate the middle ground between Dr. Cole and but I do think that in science, we kind of get obsessed with technology. So we want to agonize about the parameters and the structure of the model. But we haven't realized, what we haven't harnessed is the power of these models as a communication tool. So we should not be spending so much time fretting over, I shouldn't say this. I think it's good to fret over getting the model right, that's important. But we should be engaging with the School of Journalism and Communication on how to deploy these things in the community so that we empower people like Emmett and others against drunk driving. You know, a lot of these groups are driven by short-term outrage, like the Lakeland killings, right? Or the killings at Sandy Hook. And then that drops away when they don't get a short-term political gain. But the short-term political gain, even if you get it, doesn't really solve the problem. What you need is this longer-term perspective. And that's what we need to be doing, is going and getting our community advocates, giving them these tools so that they can develop a true long-term strategic perspective. Those mums and those dads who lost kids in Sandy Hook are still hurting and still frustrated. They still want to do something to fix the problem. They just don't know what to do anymore because they went to Capitol Hill and Capitol Hill closed the door in their face. And it's going to happen all over again. All right. Seems like it's time to close up there, people. So thanks a lot for coming. And, appreciate you.
That's okay.